Cheaper gas and tighter safety regulations are why many nuclear power plants are set to close. But the International Energy Agency says shutting them down will not only push up electricity prices, but also the volume of greenhouse gas emissions. It's urged countries to maintain their nuclear plants, which it says is cheaper than building new solar and wind farms. Nuclear is the second largest low-carbon power source in the world today and accounts for 10% of global electricity generation. If the lifespan of existing plants isn't extended and no new ones are built, developed countries could lose as much as 2/3 of their nuclear capacity by the year 2040. And to offset that, deployment of renewables would have to grow fivefold over the next 20 years. According to the IEA, a transition to clean energy would need an additional investment of $1.6 trillion over the same period. Well, for more on this, let's bring in David Elmes. He's the head of the Global Energy Research Group at Warwick Business School. Welcome to the program, David. So the International Energy Agency is essentially saying that the world needs nuclear power in order to bring down greenhouse gas emissions and therefore tackle climate change. Do you agree with that?
Well, the point that the IEA is saying is that the world has a reasonable amount of nuclear power at the moment, and if that is left to decline quickly, then the alternative is probably to use gas, which will raise emissions. But I think the point is that we're talking about a transition here, and it's different in different parts of the world. If you look in the US, yes, 90% of their power stations, nuclear power stations, are over 30 years old and some are over 60 years old. Now, extending their life costs about $40 per unit, but building a new one costs about $100. So the real issue is that extending makes sense, but new nuclear is still very expensive compared to renewables, which would be about $50 a unit.
Interesting. So the IEA sounds like it really is pushing for this nuclear power option, perhaps over advocating for ramping up new renewable energy production. Do you agree with the stance they've taken? I mean, if you say renewables are essentially cheaper, shouldn't they be pushing for that more?
So the question is, well, just how much renewables can you put on and how fast can you do it? And that's the difficult part. So the IEA is saying, we shouldn't slow down, we shouldn't sort of take away the emphasis on building up the renewables, but there's only a certain speed that you can do that whilst making sure that you have the networks to provide them, and in some cases the storage to deal with the way that nuclear is available all the time, whereas renewables aren't necessarily available all the time. So I don't believe that they're pushing nuclear at the expense of renewables. They're just saying that it's quite a tricky transition that many countries are making.
Let's look at one of those countries, Germany, obviously one of the world's biggest economies. It's been planning to phase out nuclear energy for quite some time now. It was galvanised in the wake of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. Is Germany one example of a country that's doing it well?
So Germany obviously decided after Fukushima that they would put in a law that removes nuclear power stations, and they've now done things like agree with the power companies how much the companies are going to pay to decommission the nuclear power stations, and that's something that needs to be brought into the discussion. But it is leading overall to higher energy prices for German consumers. Now, every country makes a political decision as to how much it wants energy to cost and how much of that it goes towards encouraging a transition to renewable energy. So the answer is that, yes, Germany has taken a forward step in terms of what's often called its Energiewende, but that is being reflected in the costs that people are paying, particularly German consumers.
Okay, now in terms of the alternative, you're saying that, or the IEA are saying that it's too expensive, too slow to really scale up renewable energy sources to the point that we want them to be. I mean, is there a way around that? is nuclear the only option?
No, I mean, I think what's quite interesting is you say, well, okay, if you look at the energy system today, which is very focused on solving energy by just looking at the supply side, you know, we need more energy, so let's have more renewables or possibly keep going a bit longer with nuclear. I think the really interesting thing is looking at what are we doing to reduce the amount of energy that we're using. So that means, you know, houses that are more efficient, buildings that are more economical, and of course there's a big transition happening in terms of the energy being used in transport with the potential for electric vehicles. So it is a very complicated position, and I don't believe the IEA are necessarily pushing one versus the other. But there are opportunities to look at energy in a more decentralized way and look at the way we use energy. And the question is, well, how fast are we going to be able to change that?
So looking at demand as well as supply. We'll have to leave it there, David, but thank you for your analysis as always.